Today we're going to talk about the wildly different priorities at play this past week between Democrats and Republicans, and I interview both Congressmen Jamie Raskin and Ro Khanna about the state of the progressive movement and whether we'll see Ginny Thomas testify for the January 6th committee. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. So I was going over everything that happened this past week to try and figure out what to talk about on this episode, and the dichotomy of what happened on the right versus what happened on the left was so insanely egregious that I think it's just worth it to talk about all of it. So let's start off with the Democrats. This past week, the Democratic House majority passed the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, and that decriminalizes marijuana at the federal level and expunges the records of those with cannabis convictions. The vote was 220 to 204, with 202 Republicans voting against the measure. And this is a measure that 91% of Americans support. 91%. That bill will now move to the Senate, where, thanks to the filibuster, we'll need at least 10 Republicans to vote in favor of it if it stands any chance of becoming law. Also this past week, every House Democrat voted for a bill capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month for those who are insured. 193 House Republicans voted against that. I am legitimately not sure if it's because they just want to make life more difficult for diabetics, or if they're just that enthralled by the idea of depriving Joe Biden of even the most virtuous win. But either way, if you know someone who's diabetic, you can thank those House Republicans for trying their hardest to sink this bill. This will also now head to the Senate, where, again, a bipartisan majority is needed, so we'll see if Senate Republicans are as depraved as their counterparts in the House. This past week, Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act into law, meaning that for the first time, lynching is now a federal hate crime in the United States. On gas prices, an issue that I've been talking about for weeks now, Biden announced that he'll release 1 million barrels of oil per day for 6 months from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and that equals roughly 180 million barrels of oil, the largest reserve release in U.S. history. And the Department of Energy will then use revenues from the sale of Strategic Petroleum Reserve barrels to restock the reserve when prices are lower. Not to hoard profits, not to scratch shareholders' backs, not to get rich off the backs of American consumers, but to simply provide a necessary service and then resupply so that we're prepared for the next time. And just to push back for a moment on this idea that, any president would do this, we actually have the benefit of knowing what the last president was looking to do on this exact issue. When Donald Trump was in office, he helped negotiate a deal between Russia and Saudi Arabia in 2020 to slash 9.7 million barrels of oil a day, or 10% of the world's output, because oil prices were falling. In other words, he helped coordinate a deal to help those poor oil companies who were struggling with collapsing prices, and what happened? The very next day, oil prices skyrocketed 24% for their best day on record. So even though presidents can generally do very little to impact the price of gas, they do have certain tools at their disposal. The difference is whether they're going to use those tools to help regular people or the corporations screwing those regular people over. On the issue of COVID, the Department of Health and Human Services announced that fewer people are hospitalized with COVID in the U.S. now than at any other point in the pandemic, with only 2% of hospital beds being used for COVID patients. That's some rare good news thanks to an administration that's been relentless in fighting this thing and making sure that Americans have unlimited free tests and shots and boosters. It is making a difference. And finally, on jobs numbers, U.S. employers added 431,000 jobs in March, and the unemployment rate dropped down from 3.8% to 3.6%. And just a reminder that Trump took office with a 4.7% unemployment rate and got it down to 3.5% before ultimately watching it double to 6.3%. In just 14 months, Biden got it back down almost to the lowest point it's been in 5 decades. That's all this week. And it's not to say that, everything's been perfect on the left. Democrats are still dealing with high inflation and high gas prices, but it's a pretty damn good week. Those priorities are pretty on point, and they serve as a stark contrast to what happened on the right. So let's just take a look. First off, it was revealed that Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, had been texting White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging him and others to steal the 2020 election. So while the Ted Cruzes and Josh Hawleys and Marsha Blackburns of the Republican Party were busy trying to frame the most qualified Supreme Court nominee of our lifetimes, Ketanji Brown Jackson, as being unqualified, you've got a current Supreme Court justice sitting at home with his wife who attended the insurrection rally and was peppering White House officials with texts supporting a coup. But sure, Judge Jackson's the unqualified one. Got it. In Florida, after Ron DeSantis signed the Don't Say Gay bill into law and Disney spoke out against that law, now DeSantis and Republicans are suggesting that Disney should be stripped of its special privileges in the state, which allow the company to self-govern its operations. Because if you don't kowtow to the every whim of an authoritarian GOP, then you should be punished. Like here's Laura Ingraham proving exactly that.
And when Republicans, they get back into power, Apple and Disney need to understand one thing. Everything will be on the table. Your copyright and trademark protection, your special status within certain states, and even your corporate structure itself. The Antitrust Division at Justice needs to begin the process of considering which American companies need to be broken up once and for all, for competition's sake, and ultimately for the good of the consumers who pay the bills.
Yeah, this coming from the Free Speech Party, so long as that free speech is perfectly aligned with Ron DeSantis and the rest of those fringe Republicans. In Oklahoma, the state house passed a near total ban on abortion, with the only exception being if a pregnant person's life is in danger. It would be the single most restrictive abortion ban in the United States if passed into law, and it's probably going to be passed into law. And this might be a good time for a reminder that most Americans support the right to a safe and legal abortion in the United States, but that won't stop Republicans from ensuring that no one will be able to get them if they have their way. And finally, I'm sure you've heard Republican Madison Cawthorn go on a podcast to complain that he's getting invited to orgies among his Republican colleagues. But if you haven't, here's that treat.
Being kind of a young guy in Washington with the average age of probably 60 or 70, and I look at all these people, a lot of them that I've looked up to through my life. I've always paid attention to politics, guys that, then all of a sudden you get invited to, like, well, hey, we're going to have kind of a sexual get-together at one of our homes. You should come. And I'm like, what did you just ask me to come to? Yeah. And then you realize they're asking you to come to an orgy. Yeah. Or the fact that, there's some of the people that are leading on the movement to try and remove, addiction in our country. And then you watch them do, a key bump of cocaine right in front of you.
Now, despite all the bullshit that went on in the Republican Party this past week, the orgy thing, is what made Kevin McCarthy the most angry. He reportedly had a closed-door meeting with Cawthorn and said that the freshman congressman had lost his trust. And it just goes to show that Kevin McCarthy is capable of recognizing shitty behavior and doing something about it, but the only time he actually exercises that judgment is when his own members are impacted. That's all. Not when LGBT kids are attacked, not when the batshit crazy wife of a conservative Supreme Court justice is texting the White House chief of staff to stage a coup, not when his caucus votes against legal weed or low-cost insulin. All of those are acceptable. McCarthy only draws the line, and he draws it immediately, when his precious colleagues are maligned. This is a caucus of self-important narcissists whose worlds begin and end with their own power. And whenever anything threatens that power is the only time that we'll see some kind of response. So look, the point of all of this is to show where each party's priorities lie. And it's not to suggest that Democrats are perfect, because they're not, and God knows I've spent the better part of the last year lamenting our missed opportunities. But that doesn't change the fact that right now, with what slim majority we do have, we're trying to bring the cost of insulin down. We're trying to decriminalize marijuana. We're trying to help people stay safe from COVID. We're getting people back into jobs. And meanwhile, the Republicans are attacking gay kids and fighting about coke-fueled orgies. When I say that both parties are not the same, this is proof of that. This is them broadcasting that point. And I know I made this point last week, but I think it bears repeating here. If this is what Republicans do with what limited power they have now, just imagine if they take the House, if they take the Senate. These attacks on abortion rights, on LGBT rights, on democracy itself will be vindicated, and they'll happen everywhere. Democrats being in power isn't only about what Democrats are able to accomplish with a razor-thin majority, which, again, I wish was more. It's about what they're able to stop Republicans from doing if they were in power. Because we're getting a taste of it in the states, and what we're seeing should alarm everyone. To listen to my interview with Jamie Raskin and Ro Khanna, where we discuss the state of the progressive movement, whether we'll see accountability for Trump, and whether Ginny Thomas will be called to testify for the January 6th committee, click the thumbnail right here on the screen, or check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel.